We'll get started. I was commenting on all y'all being good, loyal Baptists back there. Appreciate you being here. We'll finish up tonight. I want to kind of summarize this, and as Nathan announced this morning, look at some hard physical evidence that we have today of the resurrection of Jesus, particularly the Shroud of Turin. So as we get started, Abby Beth, would you lead us, please? Man, thank you. Jesus' passion, when he was on the road with the two travelers on the Emmaus Road, and they were talking about what had transpired and they didn't understand it, and he began to talk to them about the Old Testament prophecies. Of course, it was not a New Testament yet. And he said, did you not understand that Christ must needs have suffered? That was the whole purpose of his incarnation, the whole purpose of him being here for about 33 years, and the suffering, the crucifixion, and ultimately the resurrection was about his suffering on our behalf. And so what I want to look at here are some of the things that the gospel and the sudarium that we talked about. And Mark tells us the soldiers led him away into the hall called the Praetorium, and they called together the whole band, and they clothed him with purple and platted a crown of thorns and put it about his head and began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews." So this was mockery, of course. The purple robe and "Hail, King of the Jews" was all mockery. But Mark tells us that they platted a crown of thorns and put it on his head. And we know that. We talk about the crown of thorns, and that's one of the great symbols of Christ's suffering. And he also tells us they smote him on the head with a reed. They spat upon him. They bowed their knees and worshiped him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple from him, put his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. And so, in addition, something we probably don't look as much at, there was a long regimen here of torture. They beat him about the head with their fists. They beat him over the head with rods. They plucked his beard out, yanked his beard out. All of this, by the way, and we'll look at it in just a second, all of this we see in the man in the shroud. This is the place where the Shroud of Turin is housed. It's in Turin, Italy, and this is called the Cathedral of John the Baptist. And that's where it's been for about coming up on 700 years. And it's hard to track it beyond that, but there's been a lot of work done to do that. So on the left here, you see a positive photograph of the shroud. And you see that it's not very clear, but you can make out that there's an image of what looks like a man or a body in there. On the left is the front. On the right of that is the back. And so what happened was they laid out this long shroud made of linen, and they laid him down on it with his feet at one end, and they folded it over him. So the fold in the shroud would have been at his head. And that's what you see there. Now those real clear marks there were that it was damaged by fire hundreds of years ago, and then it was patched up. And so there's been various damage to it. You can see, I don't know if you can see with this or not, it don't show it on there, but those little holes that looks like a 7 or a backwards 7 are burn holes and so on. So the shroud has been damaged over the centuries, but it has not damaged the key parts, which shows the body of the man. And what you have on the right is a negative photograph. And so it's obviously much clearer in the negative photograph. And you can see on the right is the front of the man. His arms are crossed over his midsection. You can see all those little marks on his back. That's where he was scourged. You can see the blood around his head, which is consistent with the crown of thorns and so on. And this was not discovered until 1898 when Segundo Pia, who was a well-known Italian photographer at that time, was allowed to photograph the shroud. Prior to that time, they would take it out every so many years and let people see it from a distance and display it. They did all that down through the centuries. But photography had become a big thing, and so when they took it out in 1898, he was allowed to photograph it, and that was what he discovered, that the image in the shroud was a photographic negative, and it's so much clearer. Segundo Pia, who was a devout Christian, who took the glass plate that he had to photograph on to his darkroom and developed it. And when he came out and he looked at it, and he looked at the face of the man in the shroud, he said that he was so stunned that he almost dropped it, and he dropped to his knees and he cried out, "I'm looking at the Lord." And he was convinced that that was the case. And until that time, nobody knew that this was a photographic negative. So the image resides only on the uppermost fibers of the cloth, ruling out the possibility of chemical reactions forming the image. And although the image shows the entire body, not all parts of the cloth touch the body. To this day, scientists, physicists cannot determine how that image got on that shroud. I have something in here about it, a slide or two, but within the last week or two, there's been a study published in scientific magazines where they now think that the most likely cause of the image on the shroud is radiocarbon or radiation. But they said it would have took so much to do it in a nanosecond, which is how they believe it was done, that it cannot be replicated today. It's impossible to bring that much energy to bear in a nanosecond with radiation or thermonuclear radiation, and that if they did, it would incinerate it in a second. So they still can't explain how it got on there. But what that's saying is that the image is so superficial on the top of that linen that it doesn't penetrate it at all. It's just on the surface. And if you were to scrape it, it would be gone. And it shows the entire body. And the dark places, they believe, is where the shroud was closer. The closer the shroud was to the body, the darker it is. And so therefore you see that his nose and his chin, his beard and so forth, his hair, you can see a little bit better in that. And you can see the blood stains. These are blood stains. They've been tested. They're human blood. What limited DNA testing they've been able to do, they simply determined by DNA testing that it's human blood. They're afraid to try to go further with it because the blood's been on there for 2,000 years. One of the things that people disputed, they said, well, the blood on this shroud that's supposed to be 2,000 years old is still bright red. Well, as you know, blood turns real dark over time once it's exposed to air. But if there's enough bilirubin released into the blood, it will stay red. It will never change. And the bilirubin is released when a person is suffering agony, when they're undergoing torture. That's when the body begins to put more bilirubin into the blood cells. And that's what we have here. And so it's inexplicable. The image not created by vapors from chemicals or the corpse itself. It don't come from the corpse. The image is of the corpse, but whatever made the image on the shroud did not come from the corpse. Front and back, no image in the middle, suggesting that the cloth collapsed into a mechanically transparent body. Meaning that at the time that this image was placed on the shroud, whatever that body was, whoever that body was, it was disappearing. It disappeared in a nanosecond. And that flash of energy left the image of the body on there. So the image reveals details inside the body resembling an X-ray effect. Another thing about it is experts who look at it closely say you can see his bone structure just like it's an X-ray within that. You can see his teeth. You can see his orbits of his eyes and his skull and so forth. So it's not just the image of the body, but it also shows the interior of the body as if it had been X-rayed along with that. And of course, if the light was that intense, then you'd expect that. So this is Dr. John Jackson, a well-known physicist. He's also a missionary, Christian missionary, and he is a physicist, has done work for NASA down through the years, over the last 50 plus years. He's a real elderly man now, and his wife works with him. And he discovered in 1976 that the image on the shroud, because he had been studying it, was three-dimensional. And he discovered that because they had some type of technology as they were doing scans of the moon and the surface of planets, NASA, so that it would show the elevation of hills and mountains or whatever, or the depth of craters or whatever. He decided one night, he had a little time on his hands, that he'd take a copy of a photograph of the shroud and put it through this device, and he discovered that it was three-dimensional. And that's impossible. To this day, photography is not three-dimensional. And he discovered that in 1976. But he said a burst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation may have turned the Shroud of Turin into a perfectly sensitive medium for the recording the body's image. Creating such an image would require billions of watts of light energy, far exceeding the capabilities of any known UV source today. Additionally, the radiation would need to produce light without generating heat, as the accompanying heat would have vaporized the cloth instantly. And so John Jackson's still alive today. He's an elderly man, but he's still studying the shroud and doing a lot of work on it, does a lot of writing on it. He's published several books. There are hundreds and hundreds of books on the Shroud of Turin. There are thousands of scientific reports, official scientific reports on it, various aspects of it, and they continue to make discoveries about it. And here's from the 10th, 2 days ago, in the Jerusalem Post, and this was the headline: "Study, body image on the Shroud of Turin best explained by a burst of radiation." And so this was an article that just appeared. Image analysis paper says the pixel intensity encodes three-dimensional data that point to an energetic burst. And so they continue to study it. As technology develops, they're able to make more studies and go into other areas. And they think that the best chance of determining what to put the image on the cloth is radiation, but an incredible amount of radiation and energy that went with it. So this is a photograph on the left of the face of the man in the shroud. The one on the right is a copy of Segundo Pia's photograph in 1898. That's what he looked at and almost collapsed and dropped to his knees instead of looking at the face of the Lord. In my mind, as I've said many times, there's no question in my mind who that is. None. Barry Schwartz, who's Jewish, who has an ultra-Orthodox Jewish mother, was a well-known photographer. He was a hippie. He was a drug user. And in 1978, when they did the big study in Turin, they asked him to join the team to do the photography. And he said, "I'm not interested in that. That's a medieval relic." You know, he didn't have any use for Christians and what they believed. And he certainly didn't believe in Jesus. And they persuaded him to go, he said, by saying, "Well, look, we can go to Italy, we can party. We're going to debunk this in a matter of hours, and we'll party." And he said, "No, I'm not going." And they said, "Hey, Barry, the guy who was crucified, whoever he is a Jew." And that's what made him decide to go. Today, Barry Schwartz has one of the most extensive websites and has written books on the Shroud of Turin. He doesn't say he's converted to Christianity, but it sure sounds like he has. And he says that they cannot determine what put the image on the shroud, but there's one thing certain. It could only be one man in the history of the world that's on the shroud. And he says that's Jesus of Nazareth. That's the only man it could be because of what we know about it. So here's some of the examples. First of all, as I mentioned, the torture. Isaiah prophesied it. "I gave my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair." Now, it's hard for us to see it, but the man in the shroud, that's the lower part of his face, his beard has been plucked out. And you can see it there. And by the way, that's a painful thing. If you snatch some of the beard out of your face, that's painful. And that's why they did it. It was torture. He has a black eye. His right eye is swollen and almost closed. Can't see it all that well. And when they had blindfolded him, they struck him on the face, asked him, saying, "Prophesy, who is it that smote you?" By the way, that's one of the indications of how the Gospels support each other. Because here they're saying, "Prophesy, Who hit you? It don't make sense until we read another one who said they blindfolded him. That's why he couldn't see, and they were saying, prophesy. Who hit you? They blindfolded him, and then they smack him in the face, saying, who hit you that time? And they blacked his eye and broke his nose in the process, among other things. They spit in his face, buffeted him. Others smote him with the palms of their hands, Matthew said. And, of course, I always go back to the fact that the prophecies told us that no bone of him would be broken. That's why they didn't break his legs on the cross. He was already dead, so they speared him in the side. But his nose is broken, but as I said, that's cartilage, not bone. So they broke the cartilage of his nose, and that's when you get your nose broke. That's what you usually get broke, is the cartilage. A crown of thorns. When they'd platted a crown of thorns, they put it upon his head and a reed in his right hand and took the reed and smote him on the head. And experts who have studied this say that not only was there a crown of thorns likely placed on this man's head from the wounds, they say in the scalp and on the face and so forth, but there were probably two different ones. That they probably needed one, which was the round one that we see depicted all the time, which was it was similar to a crown that went on the head of the emperor or some high-ranking Roman official. These were Roman soldiers doing this. The other one was a cap of thorns because the priests, the Jewish priests, wore a mitre or a cap-like. So they had each one they were mocking him with, they believed. And so his head's cut up severely, and they've highlighted the blood stains where they think the thorns caused the bleeding. And then, of course, there's some around his side of his face and his mouth and so forth. Then the scourging. Pilate, therefore, took Jesus and scourged him. Now, the scourging quite often killed a man. They had no limitation on the number of lashes. Under Jewish law, it was limited to 40, so they kept it to 39. They didn't want to make sure that they didn't make a mistake and go to 41. The Romans had no limit. And so what they would do was, when they were told to scourge a man, they would beat him with various instruments that were designed to rip the flesh apart and to rip it off. Most likely, when they got through scourging him, some of his bones were exposed, particularly his ribs, the back of his ribs, maybe his vertebrae, and so forth. You can't see it there. But what you have is, from the shroud, bloodstains of wounds that were made by the scourging. Here it says there's about 120 lashes from two sides. There were two men, one was taller than the other, and they were beating him from two sides. Now, there have been studies done after I put that up there that says they've identified more than 200 now, 200 lashes. And one of the things they can see is what looks like a tiny barbell, the shape of it. And that was one of the flagellum that the Romans used, and you can see it clearly in these wounds in many places. You can see some of them there. Looks like a tiny barbell. Then bearing the cross, and he bearing the cross went forth into a place called Golgotha. It was called I can't remember exactly how to pronounce it. It slips me now, but they see evidence on his back where he probably carried the top beam, the cross beam of a cross, because it scratched and abrased his back quite a bit on top of the wounds he already had. And so no expert who's examined that disputes that. That's clearly something that he was carried on his back that was digging into his back and the wounds that he already had. So another example of all of this is on the man in the shroud. Collapsing. As they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. Him they compelled to bear his cross. It tells us that he collapsed under the weight of the cross. In the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem, which is the way of suffering, which I was privileged to follow around, we were privileged to travel on, and they have these stations of the cross. In Catholicism, they will set up, they have one down here on Spout Springs Road, they have the stations of the cross out in the woods behind the church building. And three of those places, they indicate Jesus fell there, trying to carry the beam before they gave it to Simon. And on one of his knees, his right knee, is a laceration, a severe laceration that experts say would be consistent with him having fallen, carried a heavy load onto a rocky pathway or roadway, which he was traveling through the old city of Jerusalem, trying to carry the cross to Golgotha. Even have that on there. And then we get to the crucifixion. Pilate delivered him when he had scourged him to be crucified. And so we see that they have wounds in his wrists. The blood flowed down his arms. Now, always through the years, the artists have always depicted him as having the spikes driven through his palms. After the in-depth study of the shroud began, there were men who tested that. They took cadavers and they nailed them to crosses and hung them up there. And every time the weight of the body would tear through the flesh of the hands and they would collapse off the cross. And so they determined that it had to be driven through the carpal tunnel, as I mentioned. And that's what we have. It's driven through his wrist, through his carpal tunnel. Now, another thing there, you notice you don't see his thumbs. You just see this. And the reason is that when you severely damage the nerves in the carpal tunnel, it draws the thumbs in to the palms. And so we see that there. And there are drawings of that go back beyond them knowing when they had the shroud that depict the dead body of Christ with his hands with no thumbs showing, which therefore experts say they had to have gotten that from the shroud. See, they would not have known that. They would not have known that in the Middle Ages. That's some medical knowledge that we've only gained in the past 150, 200 years, that it would do that damage. And yet, that's what we have. So we know from that they drove the spikes through the carpal tunnel and pulled the thumb to the wrist. And then the blood flowed down his arms, which would be consistent with about a 60-degree angle, they tell us. By the way, I'm just touching on this. There are books and books on this. Some of the greatest medical examiners, forensic medical examiners in the world, have done studies of the body on the shroud and go into detail about what kind of things were happening to the man who's in the shroud. And it's remarkable. They've studied all the angles of all the blood stains they can see and have drawn some detailed conclusions about it if you want to read about that. Then his feet, the God of our fathers, Luke said in Acts, raised up Jesus, whom you slew and hanged on a tree. There are nails in his feet. We always see his feet crossed over with one spike through the tops of his feet. But they recently found this in a ossuary of a man named Johanan, who was crucified about the time that Jesus lived. And you can see that the spike is driven through his heel bone. And so instead of driving it through the top of his feet, they would put their feet on either side of the upright post and drive that spike through their heel bone into the post. And then you see when they drove it through, they bent it so it couldn't be pulled out easily. So that's some of the best and most recent evidence we have of the fact that that was a method of crucifixion, part of what they did, and also that crucified men sometimes were buried in Jewish burials. This was found in an ossuary. And so that's probably what they had planned for Jesus, not knowing that he was going to be resurrected. Dislocations. He said, I'm poured out in Psalms. I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. You can see that his right hand and arm is much lower than his left one. So the right shoulder is clearly out of joint. That probably happened from hanging on the cross. It could have happened from any of the abuse pretty much they put on him, carrying the crossbeam or whatever. But most likely it happened while he's hanging on the cross that his shoulder and other joints came out of place. Incredibly painful. Some of you have had those dislocations. You know what they're like. That's what the North Vietnamese did to our airmen in the Hanoi Hilton. They would dislocate their shoulders and their elbows and their knees. Horrible pain. No bones broken. We touched on that. They saw he was dead already. They broke not his legs, John said. And that had been prophesied way back in Exodus because that was the Paschal Lamb, that they didn't break his bones. He represented Christ. Then we got the spear wound. John tells us that one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side. Forthwith came out blood and water. This is a post-mortem separation of blood and serum. That's one of the best evidences he was dead on the cross, as we talked about when they speared him. By the way, in one of the apocryphal books, the Gospel of Nicodemus, it tells us the name of the man that speared him. I don't have any reason to doubt it. He was reporting a historical thing. His name was Longinus. And they said that he became a Christian. He's also the man who said, surely this man is the Son of God, after he speared him. And all those things began. And he's honored in the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, Longinus, as having been the man who speared Jesus in the side and who uttered those words. I've always believed the man, the centurion who uttered that, was saved when he said, surely this is the Son of God. He was believing. But anyway, there it is. It's in the shroud, the spear wound, and you can see both blood on the right and serum on the left. And John, not knowing the difference, said, I saw blood and water. We saw blood and water come out of the spear wound. And then that gets us to the Sudarium of Aviato. It's called that because it's in Aviato, Spain. The napkin that was about his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself. It's the same blood type as what's on the shroud. It's the same face. I touched on that, I think, last week. And there's a picture of it with backlighting. And those are blood stains. You see how red the blood still is on it. And the napkin that was laid aside, I don't have any doubt either that that's it right there. And it's available to be seen today. And here's where Janice Bennett, she wrote Sacred Blood, Sacred Image, and she said it's a perfect fit, the Sudarium of Aviato, to the face on the shroud. And it's demonstrated on the right, all the places that it matches up. You know, when you look at fingerprints, when you compare fingerprints, or lip prints, or footprints, you know, there's only a certain number of them that you have to establish to prove it's that person. It's not the whole thing. It's only a certain number. And usually that number for fingerprints or lip prints or whatever you're doing is 7 to 10, something like that. This one is a huge number. There's no question that the Sudarium was over the face of the man in the shroud, Jesus. So she says this is proof beyond a reasonable doubt that the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Aviato once covered the bleeding face of the same man. So that has also been preserved for us. And here's the photograph on the left, and then from that photograph, with the advancement of technology, photographic technology and so forth, reconstruction, they've begun to try to get as close a likeness to Jesus when he was alive as possible, and that's one of them on the right, that they believe he would have looked very much like the image on the right before he was damaged so severely in the torture and the crucifixion. And one of the things that Barry Schwartz says about that changed his view of it was he talked about how serene the man looks, even though he's been tortured to death and crucified. And his body is so severely damaged, he has a very serene look on his face. It is finished. It is done for all of us. We were on his mind. As the old song lyric goes, when he was on the cross, I was on his mind. You were all on his mind, all of us, as he suffered. So we get to the final part here, the witness. It's a biblical principle. The truth of any matter is established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, and we get that from Deuteronomy 19. In order for a serious decision to be made about a very grave event, there had to be at least 2 witnesses and preferably 3. And so one of the things here is that there were no eyewitnesses to the resurrection. We talked about that. Nobody saw Jesus resurrected. They saw him after he was resurrected, but the resurrection itself was not witnessed. I'm not sure it was something that the human eye could have witnessed. Most likely not. If that flash of light, radiation was what they say it was, it would have blinded the person anyway, probably, if they saw it. And so there was no witness. The most significant miracle of all, the one that verified that Jesus was the Son of God beyond any doubt, nobody saw it. God had a purpose in that. But God does not violate his own word. There must be 2 or 3 witnesses to establish a matter as important as this one. So here's the first one. and we still have it today, the empty tomb. I was privileged to take that photograph, by the way. There was an Eastern Orthodox priest outside saying, let's go, let's go, let's go. They give you 30 seconds, and there's a long line, a half a mile long. And they stopped the line, the Jerusalem police, I've told you, and let us in, which I couldn't look the people in the face that we were going in front of. Had been standing there in the heat all day, but I wasn't going to turn down the opportunity either. And they would send us in 3 at a time because that's about all the room you had. Now, since that photograph was taken in 14, they have removed that marble cover and done a bunch of research on it. And they have determined that the preparation that was done originally to that tomb, that they can take it back to based on the concrete available. They had concrete way back beyond that. The Romans goes back to the time of Constantine when that was first set up. So we have the empty tomb, we have the vacant burial shroud, and we have the sudarium of Abiato, the napkin. We have 3 witnesses today that we can see. I've been privileged to see one of them. I hope that some of you will be privileged to see the others sometimes in your lifetime, especially you young folks. And so 3 witnesses. Human witnesses are all long dead. They've been dead over 1,900 years. This does not require language. It don't have to be explained to a person. All they have to do is look at it and understand it in their own language. It is physical evidence that can be viewed, that can be beheld, looked upon. And God has provided that right down to today. As a matter of fact, we know so much more about it today than any other generation has ever known. Yet the tomb, shroud, and sudarium can be seen today, witnesses to all generations. God never violates His word. He supplied the 3 witnesses, and they're still with us remarkably. The fact that we have that shroud from 2,000 years ago, the fact that we have that sudarium for 2,000 years ago, that alone should be enough proof for anybody, because there are no others. Think about all the thousands and thousands of burial shrouds. I still use them today, have been used. And there's one in existence from Israel, from Jerusalem. And guess who it is? Wasn't accidental. And not only did they save the shroud, but they saved the sudarium. They saved the empty tomb. Even though the Roman emperors and others, the Muslims, have tried to destroy it over and over again, it's still there. It's not like it was originally, but it's still there. We know where it is. So ever faithful, Acts 14, nevertheless, he left not himself without witness in that he did good. So that's what God has left us with in His infinite wisdom, His limitless power, His fathomless love. He's left us these things. And in this generation that we're privileged to live in, with all the technological advances, He's revealing it to us like it could never be revealed before. You see, the previous generations, the ones who knew about it and the ones who saw it, they believed. They weren't the doubters that we have today. They saw it. Segundo Pia, 130 years ago, he fell to his knees and cried out, I'm looking at the face of the Lord. He didn't have any doubts. He wasn't going to argue about this thing or that thing. And so on, down through the years. And there was another one, a physician who went to see it, a Christian physician. And he was allowed to see it, a display, he was allowed to get fairly close to the shroud. And he said when he looked at it, he said, I collapsed. And I fell to my knees and I cried out, I'm seeing the blood of the Lord, the blood that saved me. The shed blood that saved me, I'm looking at. He fell to his knees. He believed by what he saw. And so we have all this evidence, this overwhelming evidence. It continues to come pouring in. And when those who don't believe stand before the righteous judge, the Lord Jesus Christ, and they say, wait a minute, you're unfair, He's going to say, I showed you my burial cloth. You learned all these things about it, and you still didn't accept me. Depart from me, I don't know you. I never knew you. What a horrible thing. So He loves us. If this is not evidence of how much God loves us, I think about that so much now as I get older. What we're learning about the universe. My goodness. My goodness. And almost every day you see an article in the scientific publication that says, we didn't think this was possible. According to physics, this can't happen, and they're looking at it. That's the Creator that became flesh and died for us and suffered for us, for me, for you. My goodness, my goodness. Any question or comment? Well, I appreciate y'all coming out. I think this is about 7 nights, I believe, that we had this. We could go on talking about it for a long time. On this alone, we could spend a year looking at it on a Sunday night. I'll just give you a couple other quick things that is just amazing. The pollen, they've gotten all kinds of pollen spores off the shroud. And they've been able to identify, I don't know how many, probably 50, 60 different variations of plants. They're almost all flowers because they can see the flowers, the image of the flowers in there, some of them. They've been able to identify them, but they've identified them from the pollen, and it traces this shroud right back to Israel, to Jerusalem, and to the place where Golgotha is. And right around there, they found these pollen spores all around the head of the man in the shroud. And when they identified them, it was from a thorn bush that grows right there. Big old ugly thorns. That's where they got the crown. And it's still there. At his feet was dirt. I talked about that, about how they try to preserve all the body parts, the blood, in a Jewish burial. They were able to study the minerals in that soil and place them at the gate next to Golgotha. And what more does God need to tell the world? What more does He need to show the world? That this is the Lord Jesus Christ we are able to behold in our time. And I could go on and on, but I'll stop now. Any question or thought on it, comment? All right. Yeah, it's fascinating. I enjoy doing it. I get to reading about this and studying about this, and I'll suddenly hear a voice say, "Did you hear what I said to you?" It'll be Becky. And I'll say, how do you answer that question? No, ma'am, I'm sorry I missed it. And she'll say, stop that for just a minute. I need to talk to you. But I thoroughly enjoy it. I was going to do this morning. I didn't make it this morning, and as you know, but I was going to do a devotion this morning on the childhood home of Jesus they've discovered. Hopefully we'll show it in a week or two. Quite certain, archaeologists and historians are quite certain, it's the home he grew up in Nazareth. Amazing. And as I said, one of the kind of things that helps so much in identifying these sites are the Byzantine churches and chapels. God sent the Byzantines in there about the 4th century. And they went out, they were very religious Christian people, and they went out and they found all these sites and built churches over them. And we were blessed by that. They preserved most of them. So if you find a really important site, biblical site from the New Testament, there'll be a Byzantine church, the ruins of one right there near to it. All right. Thank you all for coming. Amy, would you dismiss us, please?